so at night, but it's nice during the day. So it's just that weird time of year. So, but I wouldn't want it hot at night. So you have to pick one.
Yeah. This is the time of year, then everyone goes into summer hibernation. And then go into fall, and then they go into winter hibernation.
Oh, so year-round hibernation.
Except for 5-6 months out of the year, people are okay with being out in the cold.
Yeah, it's been actually, I appreciate this webinar. It gave me an excuse to get a hotel and a shower. So trust me, y'all wouldn't have wanted to see me yesterday. Lots of canyon hiking and playing around in the dirt.
That's great. That's great. All right, let me do this, and we just have a few minutes.
All right, George from San Francisco, Pennsylvania. Wow, we have someone from Toronto. That's awesome. People from all over the place.
Now I need to make sure that I don't make more noise than I should. Oh, good, that's muted.
Oh, hey, Phil. Yes, Phil is on one of my workshops like in a week from now. I hope you're ready. Phil, I'll have you know I've been finding some epic new spots to take people this week. That's what I've been out here doing. So working up some good stuff for you guys.
Very cool.
And I see Richard in here too. Richard's on one of my workshops as well.
I'm just looking at another screen, people. It's not like I don't know who you guys are. I just have to monitor the whole screen, so that's why I'm looking off in the far distance here.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got my focus now. There we go. Hello, everyone. I think we should go ahead and get started.
Yeah, let's rock.
We'll open it up. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Nisi webinar series. We've been kind of quiet for a couple of months, but we have an April full of webinars coming up with you, starting with our favorite, Miss Talor Stone, who hails from Florida. I don't know what that big white thing in the screen is. Do you see that? Oh, it's gone now, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, so we have Talor tonight, who's going to be discussing filter applications. And we will have a new speaker with us, actually two new speakers, one on the 19th, one on the 21st. On the 19th, we're going to have an incredible photographer. Talor is familiar with her work. Her name is Sapna Reddy, who will discuss experiencing nature and conveying it in images. And then we also have a renowned macro photographer who's not done a webinar with us before. His name is Mike Motes, and he has a site called tinylandscapes.com. And he is an incredible macro photographer. And that's going to be somewhat of a beginner's session about how to do macro photography and how to find really interesting things when you have nothing else to shoot that day, right in the comfort of your own home or backyard. So I do want to mention that with every time we do a webinar, that we always have a little special sale for our attendees. And it is a 15% off coupon for anything that we sell at Nisi. with the exception of maybe a couple of closeouts, and I don't think we have anything going on right now there. So you can take 15% off anything that we sell on the Nisi website by using Live 15 Talor, and that coupon is good until 4/13, April 13th, 2022. We also have our new brand, which is Explorer, which is a phenomenal range of tripods, ball heads, and accessories. Soon there will be some on their way to Ms. Talor so that she can give her opinion of them. But they are fantastic pieces of equipment made specifically for the landscape photographer, people that trek, that need to make sure that no matter what they have, that it's built very well, it can handle the elements and be very portable. And I think you'd love to check out our Explorer line of tripods, ball heads, lights, L brackets, all sorts of fun things. And again, everything 15% off by using Live 15 Talor till April 13th. And without any ado, I will come up with the introduction page. And there it is. So this is what you signed up for, and this is what you're going to get. Please enjoy. Ms. Stone, please take it over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. All right, guys, so I'm just going to share my screen. And while we get started, I'll explain a little bit about why we chose to do this particular topic for a webinar. So I teach a lot of workshops, and one of the most common questions I get when we're out there and shooting is, what filters should you be applying, or will it help your photo or not? And the fact that sometimes these questions arise in situations that may not be appropriate for filters, or they're asking about the wrong type of filter, it tells me that maybe this is a good time to get back to the basics and talk about why we use the filters that we use, and how do we make those decisions when we're actually out there practicing photography in the field. So what I've tried to do with this presentation is really just break it back down to basics. And it's a very simple 3-question model for you to make a decision in the field about whether or not you need to use a filter. And it really is very simplified, but I think it could actually help quite a bit in terms of making progress with your photography and making smarter decisions in the field with what types of filters you're using. So a little bit about me. I came to photography a little bit later in life, but it was always my first passion. So I'm really excited that I get to do this for a living now. I'm also a huge nerd. So I'm a Ph.D. researcher, and all of my research is about the way that climate change is impacting Arctic indigenous people. I focus a lot specifically on Greenland. And because I'm a huge nerd and I love photography, I really enjoy teaching. So that includes these webinars, but also workshops in the field, or really any way that I can interact with people and share my love of photography. And of course, I'm very proud to be a Nisi ambassador, because in my opinion, they make the best optical glass on the market. And I'm just obsessed with using all of the Nisi filters that I have, including the new Explorer stuff. So a little plug for Jem. He's right. Those tripods are solid. They're really awesome. So just a quick overview of what we're doing. Today, we're going to talk about approaching a scene. When do you make a decision about filters? And then the model, it's really basic. It's just 3 key questions so that you can make the right decisions in the field quickly and efficiently for what types of filters you may or may not want to apply. And then we'll talk a little bit about execution and the way in which you apply them. So when you're first approaching a scene, I think we all go through the same basic steps. You have a subject, you identify your subject, you're walking out. Imagine that you're walking out to Zabriskie Point or some beautiful scenic place, and you identify your subject. Maybe it's a mountain in the background, or this really interesting rock formation. Maybe it's the way a river curves, but you identify your subject first. The next thing that most of us are going to do is think about our composition. So we have our subject. How do we want to place it in our frame to create a nicely balanced composition? And then you actually move into executing your photo. But the question is, where do filters come in to this whole process? And I would say that filters come in right before the execution. So you identify your subject and your composition. And then what I usually do is think about what types of filters may I want to apply to this scene in order to get the most out of this photo. So it usually is right before I begin to actually execute the photo, which is figuring out my exposure, my shutter speed, my aperture. So I usually make the filter choice before I start worrying about that. So before you start worrying about trying to fine tune that exposure, there are 3 key questions that I'm going to present to you that will help you decide which filter you want to apply. The first one is there water or glare in your scene? The second is, do you want to show movement? And the third is there high dynamic range in your image? So don't worry, you don't have to write this down because we're going to break all of these down individually one by one. So starting with the first one, is there water or glare? So glare can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from leaves, clouds, water, even rocks, pretty much anything that you're looking at, it's capable of producing glare. So in this image, you can see that there's bright glare on the lily pads in the water. In this image, the sky is pretty washed out. It's very glary. If you were to look at this without your camera, you'd probably squint your eyes. Even the rocks in this photo, all the wet surfaces are covered in glare. You can't see through the water at all because it's just coated in glare. So really, glare can detract from your image because an image that could otherwise be very sound ends up being compromised by a lot of glare being present. So where does glare come from? It's caused by randomized light. And if you want to get really nerdy about glare and polarizers and all of that, then I do have a webinar that is on Nisi's YouTube channel. So you could get really deep dive about glare and light wavelengths there. But just at a surface level, randomized light is caused when sunlight departs from the sun and it impacts something around us. That can be the atmosphere, it can be clouds, rocks, anything that you can see, the light is impacting it and it's bouncing off. That scattered light or randomized light can bounce back in an infinite number of directions. So when we're squinting in the natural environment, that's what we're doing. We're trying to block out that glare that's bouncing back at us. So when you have glare, it reduces the true colors, the contrast, saturation, and the detail of a photo. So one of the solutions for this is a polarizer. So a polarizer works by taking the unpolarized light, and it's like window blinds where it's filtering out certain wavelengths of light, and you can spin the polarizer so that it blocks the glare wavelength and allows just the true natural light to come through the polarizing filter, and it creates linearly polarized light. So again, if you want a really deep dive, I recommend checking out that other webinar because we really get into the fine details of how a polarizer works. It's actually pretty fascinating. So the solution to deal with glare is going to be a polarizer. So let's go back and ask our questions again. Is there water or glare in an image? So a polarizer, if you apply it properly and you rotate it to the correct orientation, it will reveal the true colors. Again, this is the exact same photo. All I've done is spun the polarizer and it looks completely different. Now you can see the true colors of the leaves and the water is nice and dark, and it allows the beautiful light of that flower to just glow through the image. And you wouldn't be able to see that otherwise because in the previous image, it was totally drowned out by all the glare. In this example, atmospheric haze in the particles in the atmosphere can also reflect light, and that produces glare and haze in our images, especially if you're shooting over a great distance. You'll notice atmospheric haze, and a polarizer can often help with that by reducing the haze and introducing more contrast between especially like white puffy clouds and a blue sky. So again, all I've done is spun the polarizer, and it makes the cloud just separate from the sky, and it reduces that hazy feeling in the image. And it really enhances wet surfaces. So anytime I have something that's wet in the image, whether that's a river, wet rocks, wet leaves, anything with water on it, I'm going to be applying a polarizer. So it'll take this image, which is just completely destroyed by glare. And all you do is spin the polarizer and you can see the rich tones and the beautiful detail of the scene. And it's all just revealed simply by using a polarizer. And the really interesting thing to me about polarizers is that there is nothing that you can do in post-processing to really replicate this. There's very little that you can do in terms of editing that's going to replace what polarizers do. So it's one of those things, if you don't have it, you just don't have it. It's a must-have item in any photographer's kit, especially if you're a landscape photographer. A polarizer really does help you get the most out of your photos. So let's move on to our second question. Do you want to show movement in your image? So there are many ways to show movement in a photo. It can be through composition or the way that you arrange certain items, the way that you create visual flow. But the most common way is to slow your shutter speed. So on the right, you can see two different images that are identical in every way, except for the shutter speed that's used. And you can use a slower shutter speed to move moving items like clouds, water, whatever it may be in your scene that is moving, and to blur it to introduce more movement into your still image. So using different shutter speeds can have different effects. You can use a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. It's very intense, dramatic. You can slow it a little bit to introduce textures in your images, or you can slow it quite a bit and really create soft blurs of movement. In this case, I was panning across the ocean, but you can use slower shutter speeds to introduce movement for a variety of effects. One of the other awesome things that shutter speed does is it conveys a mood or emotion. So in this image, it was a pretty fast shutter speed. I was just hand holding and I caught some of the action of the waves. I loved how dynamic it felt and the feeling of action and intensity in the photo. But this is the same location, only a couple minutes apart, slightly different angle because I got lower down on the rocks. And in this image, I wanted to slow my shutter speed to really soften the image and create this dreamy feeling. So using a slower shutter speed just conveyed a completely different mood and a different emotion out of this photo, even though they were taken back to back. In this image, it gives me anxiety. It's really stressful. Like there's a lot of action going on. I really dislike it, but the composition is solid. So all I have to do is just lengthen the shutter speed and now it's calming and it's tranquil and it doesn't give me a feeling of anxiety just from looking at it. And I can actually focus on the image, which has this beautiful green glowing moss. So all I've done is extend my shutter speed to change the mood or emotion of the image completely. So if you want to show movement, usually you're going to apply an ND filter. You want to lengthen your shutter speed. The easiest way to do it is to apply an ND filter. So when you apply an ND filter, it gives you a lot of creative control over the story that you're telling. So it allows you to provide contrast between the soft elements and the harder elements. And it also can introduce new compositional elements. So in this image, using a slower shutter speed created a flow through the frame that wouldn't have been there without using an ND filter because you wouldn't be able to see this beautiful flow as easily. So applying an ND filter and slowing your shutter speed allows you to really take control of your image and give you creative control over producing the image that you envision. So this brings us to our third question. Is there high dynamic range? And in some regards, this is the more complicated question to answer. So first, you have to understand what high dynamic range is. So in this diagram, you can see what the human eye is able to see detail in versus what a camera can see detail in. These are just approximations, but generally speaking, the human eye can see almost twice what a camera can see in terms of detail in your shadows and your brights at the same time. So the human eye, really, like machinery, just hasn't caught up with how amazing creations that we already are. So when you have a high dynamic range image, your camera is going to struggle to render high quality detail in the dark shadows and the bright white areas. It introduces a lot of technical challenges that are just the limitations of using machine to produce an image. So let's talk about how to identify a high dynamic range image. So in this particular photo, this is a very low dynamic range image. There's not a lot of contrast in it, which means that there's not a lot of difference between the white and dark areas. So on the left side of the histogram are your blacks, on the right side are your whites, and you can see that the tonal values are bunched together towards the highlight area, and there's not a lot of distribution across the whole range between black and white. This image has what I would consider a very normal distribution for a histogram. It's the traditional bell curve. It's really what we would all love to see in our images because it means it's pretty easy to edit. We have lots of midtones and we can really tease it apart and separate it. It gives us a lot of creative play area. So we have lots of midtones in this image, and it kind of just tapers out to the whites and the darks at the end. And then this is a high dynamic range image. So you'll see on the histogram that we have lots of values that are bunched together in the blacks, and that's because of the black rock and the black sand. And then lots of values bunched together at the whites, and that was caused because it was just a really ugly, overcast, hazy sky, and it was hard to get great pictures because the sky just blew out. It was totally white in all the images. So this is a high dynamic range image where you see that there's a lot of separation between the blacks and the whites. So if you overlay that histogram over the little diagram that we were looking at earlier, you'll see that in a high dynamic range image, a lot of your values are going to be outside of the area that the camera is actually able to render a lot of detail in. So it's a huge technical challenge that you have to be able to overcome. To some extent, you can do this with editing if you're careful and you don't clip your blacks and whites, but that's not always the case, and it may not always be the best way to go about it. So one of the other tools that you can use is a graduated neutral density filter, or a GND. So there are many ways that this can be super helpful for correcting a high dynamic range image in camera without having to do all these post-processing magic tricks. But there are caveats that go along with it. So we'll talk a little bit about this. When you're managing a high dynamic range image, you really only have 4 options available to you. You can create an HDR image. And I've included this photo because this is like very, very early when I first started taking pictures, and I just discovered what creating an HDR was, which was very fun. And I think we probably have all gone through this phase where you really get overzealous with creating HDR images, and they can end up looking not very lifelike. In this image, you see that there's like no shadows. I mean, that just is not natural looking at all. The colors look very poppy. So HDRs do have downsides, but they can be used appropriately if you're careful with them. So this is an HDR file that I created, and I'll show you how I actually created it, but it's important to look first at this histogram and see where the values are. So it's not a super high dynamic range image anymore because we don't have our values separated at either end of the histogram. So I created that using this image, which is very dark, and you'll see all the values bunched up at the end. And then this image, which is very bright, and all the values are bunched up against the white area. And when I blend them together using Lightroom, or you could use any number of other platforms, I use Lightroom, then you'll see that it kind of marries out these tones in the image, and the histogram distribution becomes much more favorable for actually editing your photo. Your blacks aren't super clipped, and neither are your whites now. Now you have a second option. You can aggressively edit your shadows or highlights. I rail against this in my post-processing classes. I think that it's it's something I see a lot of people do, and I want to demonstrate why it really damages your photo. So if you're one of the people that takes your highlights all the way down or your shadows all the way up, you should probably listen. This part's for you. Also, this is for the people who take an image and of, say, a sunset or a sunrise and the sky's really bright and they don't want to apply a grad filter. And I hear people say in the field quite a bit, well, I'll just fix it in post-processing. Well, this is what can happen. So if you properly expose an image, we're going to have very low noise in this image versus this is a darker exposure that was taken, which I just corrected in post-processing by brightening my shadows all the way to 100 to get it to be properly exposed. And you can see how much noise becomes introduced in that image. When you really, really aggressively brighten your shadows, you destroy the quality of that file. So it's super important not to shoot with the intention of just correcting your shadows later, because you're damaging the quality of that image. And the same goes for highlights, where if you have a really, really overexposed area and you just plan on using a graduated filter in Lightroom to correct it later, there's a really good chance you're going to totally muddy down those whites. They're going to become an ugly gray, and it's really, really hard to fix in a way that looks natural later. So it's just best not to take this approach of really aggressively editing your shadows or highlights, or planning to just fix it in post. So I really caution against this approach. Now, the third thing that you could do is just blend multiple exposures later. Now, you'll see that this is an image of just a luminosity mask that's created in Photoshop. I'm not going to go into all the details of how to do it, but it is a little bit more complicated. There's no reason not to do this type of editing. However, there are situations where it won't work well. So for example, if we're photographing a waterfall and the foliage might be moving, and maybe there's a tree that's moving, or there's some element of the image that's not totally static, good luck creating a luminosity mask that's going to overlay well in Photoshop. I mean, that is going to be the challenge of the century for you. So it can be really, really hard or virtually impossible to blend exposures later, depending on the scene that you're shooting. And it requires some additional technical and editing skills that most people may not have, especially when they're just starting out. So it may or may not be a good option for you. Now, the fourth option is to use a graduated neutral density filter. Now, I do get challenged about my use of them out in the field quite a bit, because people do tell me, well, why don't you just do it in post, or you could blend multiple exposures later? And they're correct in some cases. I may be able to do that. Personally, for me, I really get a lot of joy out of creating an image out of a single file. And that means sometimes that I have to control my dynamic range in camera. And like I mentioned, there are certain scenarios where there's moving foliage or something else in the image that's changing, where it's not possible to use these other techniques. You have to get it in a single shot. That's the case with wildlife. It's the case with moving foliage. It's the case if you're doing any type of portrait shooting or anything where you just can't sit there and wait for it to be perfect. The only solution is going to be using a graduated filter. So in this example, I loved the scene, but I was very distracted by how bright the upper right corner was, because that wasn't the focus of my scene. I was more interested in the beautiful green moss. So one of the solutions is just applying an ND filter. Same exact image, all the settings are identical. All I did was drop in a graduated filter to control the highlights in the top. And now the subject of the image is the green moss in the photo. Same in this photo. I loved the overall scene, but it was completely distracted by how bright the top of the image was. The only solution was going to be doing multiple exposures and trying to marry it all together later, which for me, it sounds kind of like a headache. I don't really like to edit that much, so I prefer not to. Or takes 5 seconds, throw on a graduated filter, and immediately I have a better image. And like, these are unedited photos. These are just my baseline image so that I can start my editing process. So I would argue between this image and this one, I'm starting from a much better place when I begin my editing. And it's pretty common to run into bright skies at sunset or sunrise. I really loved this very simple scene, but the sky was super bright. Now, this is an image where I could have blended multiple images together in post-processing, or I could just put on a graduated filter. It takes me about 2 seconds, and I just immediately have a single file, and I don't have to worry about all the editing and tinkering later on. So I just get it right out the gate. So there's an important caveat, which is that you have to know when it's appropriate to do this, because a graduated filter is dark at the top and lighter at the bottom for most filters. So it's not always going to be the perfect solution. In this image from Iceland, I couldn't apply a graduated filter because it would have darkened the top of the cave so badly in order to correct the sky. It just wouldn't have worked. And what I ended up having to do is taking multiple exposures and blending them together later. So I took an exposure that was much brighter in exposure for the inside of the cave, and then a darker image for the sky, and I blended them together later. Versus this image, it's very simple to throw on a graduated filter just to darken the corner of the sky and control the highlights so I can get the image in a single shot.
Taylor.
Yes, Jim.
Hi there. Sorry to pipe in, but a question just came up that it's apropos to what you're talking about right now, which is what type of GND are you using in these photos? And maybe you can also, I'm sure you're going to do it at some point, but discuss what the various different GNDs that are made, what their differences are.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Let's back up for just a second here, if it'll let me. Here, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go back into sharing, because I want to actually bring it up so that we can see. There we go. So here you can see the different types of graduated filters. So I'll make this a little bit larger. Why is it doing that? I don't know why it's not allowing me to go back to that page, but anyway, so on the left here is a soft graduated filter where the feather, which is the amount of space it takes to go from very dark to very light, is very, very soft. And I use a soft graduated filter when I have an irregular horizon line. Say there's some rolling hills, maybe some trees. I always use a soft filter for things like waterfalls or anywhere where I don't have a clearly defined horizon. Now, I often use a medium filter, which is this, which is just a slightly harder transition between the dark area and the lighter area. So with a medium filter, I would not want to apply that if there's like a mountain or a building going across the top, right? Because then I would be cutting it in half. Instead, I would use it for something that has a slightly more defined horizon, but it doesn't have to be totally flat. Just something that, you know, is not like a mountain sticking up in the middle of the scene. And then a hard graduated filter has a hard line between in the transition zone between no neutral density effect and the entirety of the neutral density effect. And that's only applicable when you have a completely flat horizon line. For example, a seascape where the horizon is completely flat. And I personally don't really use one. I know that they do come in handy and, you know, quite a few people do use them. Personally, I think that there's very little room for error. You really do have to be diligent about getting that transition line exactly where it needs to be. Now, if you take your time and do that, then you're going to get a great shot. But for me, I'm usually pretty quick when I'm shooting. So I rarely go about applying a hard graduated neutral density filter. And then there's another type called a reverse. So that's this one right here. Hopefully you can see where my mouse is hovering. And that's where the darker area is actually in the center. And it's ideal for sunsets or sunrises when the brightest area of your scene is towards the horizon. So if you're shooting kind of towards the sun during sunset or sunrise, then a reverse can be really helpful. But it's often not helpful in other situations. So it's very specific in its use. So hopefully that helps. Was there any follow-up question about that, Jim?
No, that you covered it beautifully.
Okay. Yeah. So for example, in this photo, I was using a medium graduated ND filter because it was very easy for me to line up that transition zone pretty closely along this diagonal line. And so using a medium is pretty straightforward. I just kind of get it about lined up there and I'll be good to go. So we talked about the 3 questions. So I just want to reiterate them now. So hopefully we just drill them down kind of in your mind because I really do want you to be asking yourself these things when you go out in the field. So the first one, is there water or glare in your photo? Hopefully by now you're all thinking, add a polarizer. So if you see water or glare in your photo, what should you be thinking? Should you add a polarizer? It doesn't mean it's always going to be the right call, but it's what you should be thinking about. Could I add a polarizer to improve this image? And should I maybe consider playing with it and applying it and seeing if it works for that shot? Now, the next question, do you want to show movement in your photo? So hopefully by now you're thinking, add an ND filter. So if you want to show movement, one of the easiest ways to do it is to slow your shutter speed. And often you need to add an ND filter to have that effect. So add an ND filter if you're thinking about showing movement or slowing your shutter speed. Is there high dynamic range in your image? Now, we talked about there are multiple ways to manage high dynamic range in your scene, but you should probably try a graduated filter. And if you're not already a believer in why graduated filters can be really, really helpful, hopefully my presentation convinced you, especially when you see the damage that aggressively editing your shadows and highlights can do. So now that we have kind of dialed in our 3 questions, let's talk about the execution of actually creating this image. Because so far, all we talked about is the thought process of the creative process of deciding how you want, what filters you might want to apply, how do you approach the image, what's going to improve your photo. So now it's time to actually take the filters, put them on the camera. So the order in which you do this matters quite a bit. So you can combine filters, and the order in which you ask yourself those questions was not accidental. I asked them in the order in which I would apply the filters. So in this photo, I've combined a circular polarizer and a graduated neutral density filter to create an image where I was able to reduce glare and also manage the dynamic range of the file. In this image, I combined all 3. So I used a polarizer to manage the glare. I used a 3-stop ND to slow down and show movement. And I used a graduated filter to control the highlights in the upper right-hand side of the image so that it didn't distract from the beautiful light beams that were going across the water. So yes, you can combine your filters. And in fact, that's something I do all the time. I'm like notorious for stacking my filters like a crazy person. But I really enjoy doing it because I love creating single images that I can work on rather than merging them together later. And trying to decide what order in which you arrange your filter, that also goes back to the debate of round versus square filter systems. So I always get questions about this, so I figured let's talk about it. So there are merits to both round and square filter systems. The only deciding factor is your needs. So there is no such thing as like one is better than the other. It just depends on what you're doing with them. So a round filter system is great if you want to have something that's super lightweight and compact, really durable. If you're avid hiker, backpacker, outdoors a lot, you want to travel light, you don't want a big camera bag, then you probably want a round filter system because they're really, really easy to just slip it in your camera bag and it takes up no space at all, and you can mount them pretty quickly. Now, if you want to stack your filters like I do, if you want to use neutral density filters on a wide angle lens, so that's like if you want to use a wide angle lens for seascapes or waterfalls, or if you want to use graduated neutral density filters, then you need to do a square filter system. You can, of course, kind of hodgepodge it together. And I know how it goes, right? Like when I started out photography, I had just this random pile of filters that were all different sizes, and it wasn't like a whole system. But I do highly recommend, if you're in the market for filters, just go ahead and invest in a whole system. Pick the system that's going to be right for you based on some of this information. And of course, you can ask me, ask Jim, do your own research. But I really recommend that you just go ahead and invest in a full system so that you have a single kit that you're working with. It really does make a difference. So if you like to stack, really you need a square filter system because you can quickly run into vignetting issues with circular or round filters. Now, if you want to use wide angle, again, square filter system is ideal because you're not going to run into vignetting issues. And using a graduated neutral density filter, really square is the only system that makes sense because most images, the horizon's not always going to be dead center for every photo, right? So if you use a circular system, you can't adjust it up or down. You're stuck with the horizon being dead center for every single photo you ever want to take. But a square system, you can totally adjust and move it up and down, rotate it around so that you can perfectly align that graduated effect with the specific image you're taking, which really, you want that type of creative control whenever you're taking a photo. All right. So hopefully that answers your questions about should you do a round or a square filter system. And honestly, my advice is to just go for it and fully invest in whichever one that you choose. And I have gotten a question before about whether or not stacking images can degrade the quality of your image. And here's my answer for that. It can, unless you're using a high quality filter system, which this is a plug for Nisi. They have amazing filters. I'm not just saying that, I mean it. I've never had any quality degradation or sharpness degradation by stacking the filters. So if you're using really high quality glass, that's optical quality glass, you're going to be just fine. I wouldn't even worry about it. Just get the shot that you're dreaming of and don't worry about it. So let's go over the bottom line. Filters, when you're thinking about whether or not to apply it, pick your subject and your composition, and then make sure you're asking yourself those 3 questions to help you make a decision about what filters you should apply. Make sure that you are choosing the right filter system for you. And part of that means that you're choosing a high quality system that is not going to actually create more problems once you start stacking it and playing around with it. Make sure you're choosing a high quality system that is the right choice for you, whether it's square or round, doesn't matter as long as it's the right for what you're shooting. And don't be afraid to just stack them and have a good time. I think that it really opens up a whole lot of doors once you start getting creative about filter use. So I highly recommend that you just have a good time with them and see what type of things you can create. So if you want to find me online, it's Talor Stone, and it's pop quiz. Can you spell my name? There is no Y in it. So you can find me online if you can spell my name properly. So there's my information if you just want to screenshot it, and I'd be really happy to take some questions now.
Actually, there was a question about, I received the Nisi graduated filter system for Christmas, have not had a chance to use it yet. Is there a webinar on how to use the system now?
Oh, I think that might be an idea for a new topic, Jim.
Well, actually, I do want you to try our switch holder, which I'll discuss with you offline, but that actually allows you to use 2 graduated filters on different angles to really get control of your light. But Laura, the person who asked the question, I was just typing and saying we can always support you by calling the office. We have Roger here, who is a consummate photographer and a real expert on our product, and he can walk you through it and even do a one-on-one Zoom call with you. So I'm going to actually put that out there, and you can take it off of the chat. So, Taylor, what procedure do you use to keep your filters clean?
That's a great question. Well, okay, so I just feel like it's a Nisi commercial, but it's really how I feel. So the cool thing about the Nisi filters is the nano coating really prevents them from getting a lot of dirt on them, which is far and above better than a lot of the lower quality or cheaper filters that you can get that really are hard to keep clean. The Nisi ones, really you just take a blower, because the dust and dirt, it doesn't stick to them. It just won't stick to them. And if I do have to do any cleaning, I don't really use a lens cloth because over time that can create scratching. But what I usually do is Zeiss makes these alcohol wipes, and they're super, super cheap. And I just, you can get them right on Amazon. It's Zeiss lens wipes, and they are awesome. So I definitely do that.
All right.
Gary
So,
has a good question about panoramic images. So, all right, so that's tricky. That, man, coming at me with good questions. So if I do not recommend using a polarizer if you are doing a panoramic image, unless it's like a very long telephoto shot. And the reason, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, I recommend just watching the polarizer YouTube video that's on the Nisi channel that I did not too long ago. But what happens is the amount of polarization changes as you move from side to side, and it can create blotchy looking areas in your sky. So make sure you take off a polarizer if you're going to do a panorama, but the other filters still work fine. All right. Hopefully, Gary, that answered your question. Pointers on using ND filters in daylight. So you can use them any time of day. And so what I usually do is I shoot mirrorless, and using the live view exposure compensation, the electronic, not exposure compensation. I'm drawing a blank here, where exposure simulation, there we go. In live view with a mirrorless camera, up to 30 seconds, you're able to simulate what your exposure is going to look like. But another trick, especially if you're shooting DSLR, is that Nisi has an exposure calculator app, and you just plug in the numbers and it kind of tells you there's the shutter speed. It may not always be exactly correct. I usually find that it takes some tweaking up or down, but it gets you right in the ballpark, and you can adjust from there. All right.
here's a good one. This one, our anonymous visitor or anonymous participant in Australia might need to answer this one. Is there any plans for a curved graduations? And what might curved graduations do for you? I think the switch that I mentioned, this is from John McLean, who's watching us on YouTube. I think that the switch actually is something that should be looked at. It is a filter holder that takes two filters, but each filter can be rotated on its own axis, so that you can actually position the graduated filters where you need them and create the shape that you need.
Yeah, Jim, that pretty much gives you almost a curve. It's not a perfect curve, but it's almost like a roof of a house, and you can overlap them a little bit, so it does almost become a curve. But to create a curved grad is a very difficult task. And I'm just not sure how useful it would be in a lot of situations.
Oh, here comes that question. Thank you, Andrew. That is Andrew, who is with us from Sydney, and he's not the only one here from Australia, because we have Chris on the YouTube channel, who's also from Australia. So,
could I also just mention one more thing? The question about using ND filters during the day. I love shooting with a 15 stop during midday kind of sun. You can get 3 to 5 minute exposures, and it really opens up your shooting time from kind of the golden times of the day to being all day, and you can get some amazing shots with great blue sky with some streaky white clouds over them during the day. And it's a really cool, fun thing to try, and just try shooting at different times of the day, seeing what you can capture. It's something that I love doing with workshop participants because they're so used to just getting up early and shooting at sunrise and sunset, but you can actually get some great shots with ND filters in bright sunlight.
And it's
I agree with Andrew completely on that. That's like total trick that I used on workshops as well, because otherwise you really are pigeonholed for like certain times a day, but you could take totally flat light and like maybe you have a cool composition, but the light is just garbage, but there's cool clouds and you can pull a really great photo out of that.
Yeah.
So the question we always get on the on this is there plans for a magnetic adapter? And the answer there is no, but we are going to be showing something pretty clever in a few months, so you might want to check into that. But the bottom line on a magnetic adapter is that as good as they are not attached to your lens. And when the kind of photographers that we work with are hiking and walking through the woods and stepping over rocks and everything, and if it jostles and lets loose and drops, you'll probably never hear it. And then you'll look down and your filter won't be there. I think they're a great solution, but we can't support it knowing our primary clientele.
Yeah, I second what Jim just said, because I did demo a kit of magnetic filters about a year ago, and within, I don't know, an hour of shooting, I lost one in a river because I just set my tripod down and it fell off. So I would never personally use them just based on that experience alone. So I don't think you're missing out too much. I did want to, Karen asked about the natural night filters. I actually recently got a chance to try one. Thanks, Jim. And I thought that it was really fun, especially for cityscapes. I went shooting downtown and I loved the way that it took all the yellow cast out of the street lights, and it ended up giving it this really rich, totally different set of tones. It was really unexpected. I thought it was super fun. And I know it can also be good for night sky stuff during like Milky Way, for example. But for me personally, I was super surprised by how fun that was.
You want to hear something that's even more fun?
Yes.
Use your natural night filter and use a graduated filter upside down so that you can darken the cityscape and allow the sky to come out.
Okay. All right. Challenge accepted, Jim.
You got it.
I see Lee. Hey, Lee. He asked me about the black mist filter. I haven't used it yet, and I have to say I'm really intrigued by it, and I do want to try it. Hint, Jim. That one looks really cool. So the black mist filter, for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, it kind of creates this glowy effect around lights, and I definitely would love to get my hands on one of those. Let's see, magnetic adapter. Oh, someone did ask about the lens hood. Who asked?
Was that about how to put filters on a lens over the lens?
Okay.
That's B. DeWitt, who I'm just answering and saying that with the we have a system for people who use the ultra wide lenses, such as the Tamron 15-30, Sigma 14-24, the older Nikon 14-24 for the DSLR lenses, Sigma 14-18, several lenses, when they don't have a front thread. What we have is we have a solution where we have a special holder that has a locking collar, so you can slide it over the pedal lens hood. It drops into place, and then there's a compression ring that locks it into place. You don't need to take the lens off the camera. It's very easy. It does use 150 millimeter filters, which are even bigger and more cumbersome than 100 millimeter filters, but it's the solution, and it's a great solution there if that's what you want. Now, Matt just said about love the back-end filters for the 15 to 30. The back-end filters are a great solution. I have an issue with them. I have two issues with them. Three issues if you count that we don't make them. But the two real issues are, first of all, it's actually well known among people who know lenses well that you can have a lot of little dust spots and artifacts and everything on the front of a lens, and you'll never see them in your final image. But if those are on the rear element of the lens, you will see them. They will create shadowing and they will create distortions on the sensor. The other thing is that if you want to change filters, and where are you when you're doing landscapes? You're out in nature, which is beautiful, but not that, sterile. And you're taking your lens off to change filters and getting all sorts of nasty stuff inside your camera body during that time. But, but they're cool. And if you're careful and, and you like retouching on your, when you get home, they're great.
So Rick was asking about fingerprints on the filters. Yeah, I mean, that's just a losing battle. Personally, I just always grip them from the side. I don't like pinch them. I grip them this way so that my fingers are only on the exterior edges. And that part of the filter is never in the image. So if you looked at my filters, they're really grungy on the sides, but it doesn't matter because you can't see them.
Have you ever used our Clever Cleaner, Taylor? It's a little
white
flat pad. It's a little flat pad. It's a little tool. It's a little flat pad on a stick. If Andrew can, maybe he can bring it up real quick. And you can really clean your filters extremely quickly while in the field. Also,
okay.
a microfiber cloth will clean off fingerprints from Nisi filters very quickly, because one of the key attributes of our filters is that the nano coating makes them extremely easy to clean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I said that earlier. I'll say it again. I mean, the coating makes all the difference. Most of the time, a blower will take pretty much anything off, and then it just wipes right off. It's pretty easy.
And I'm just going to throw it back at Matt one more time. I can't argue with you there. It's a very good solution. It's very small, very compact, and very reasonable. I totally get that. Totally get that. So I'm trying to think. Is there
There we
anything
go. There's a little cleaner.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Cool. Awesome. Well, do y'all have any other questions? I'm happy to continue answering them. Matt had a question about the Sunstar lens. What's your question, Matt? Oh, I see. Earlier you were saying that you found it a little on the dark side. I mean, every lens is slightly different in the amount of light that it lets in. I have the Sunstar lens as well, and I recently wrote a review on it. Personally, I really love it. And even if it renders a little bit dark, each lens is just slightly different. I personally didn't find it very dark at all, maybe just marginally.
If I can kick in, I think what Matt's saying is that it's only an f4. And Matt, you know what? We recognize that, but Nisi brought it out. You have to kind of think of the Nisi Sunstar as almost an accessory to our landscape filter system. Mm-hmm. It's because that it can use a 72 millimeter filter without vignetting. It can use the V7 or V6 systems without vignetting. And a landscape photographer doesn't necessarily shoot in the dark. And actually, even night sky photographers will typically shoot at f5, 6, and f8, to get into the meat of the best part of the lens, the sharpest part of the lens. But you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I wish it were a 1.4 lens.
I love that it's the low distortion's awesome though. And I've had a lot of fun shooting with it. It's super sharp little lens. And for the price, I mean, it's hard to beat. Like if you don't want to invest in a super like ultra wide lens that's going to cost $2,000, you could get the Nisi Sunstar lens. It says Sunstar, but you don't have to shoot a Sunstar with it. Shoot anything with it. It's super sharp. It's awesome.
Well, you did that comparison of that in your Canon lens.
Yes. Yeah, I did a side-by-side comparison between the Canon lens and the Nisi lens. They're both 15 millimeter lenses. And the Nisi lens had significantly less distortion than the Canon lens did. It was equally as sharp. I couldn't find a single difference in sharpness, honestly. And I mean, I was really trying. And I had a lot of fun shooting with it, especially the cityscapes at night was so fun. I put some images on my website of that in my review, and making all the little street lights pop. It just was a lot of fun. Derek had a really good question about graduated neutral density filters. He asked, how do you handle using a graduated filter without darkening part of the sea stacks above the horizon too much? And that's a great question. There's not always an easy answer to that. And sometimes you're not going to be able to use a graduated filter. So in the image that I showed in the presentation with the sea stacks, I did not use a graduated filter. And if I wanted to in that image, you could maybe get away with using a soft filter over part of the sky, but you have to be really, really careful not to overly darken the part of your subject that's protruding above the horizon. So it's something that just requires you to think a little bit critically and make sure you're picking up on these accidents in the field before you get back and realize, oh man, like I messed up this image in the field and you can't go back and redo it. So it's just, you have to make sure that you're using your brain and asking whether or not you're helping or harming your image. Let's see. Any other questions, guys? Asking if the calculations for shutter speed, there are a bunch of different apps for calculating your shutter speed. Nisi makes one, so PhotoPills has it built in as well. And there's like a bunch of other different brand ones. So it really doesn't matter which one you use. The math is basically the same. And really like the calculator apps, they do a good job at getting you really close to your correct exposure, but you usually do have to fine tune it a little bit because every lens is a little bit different. Every camera deals with the light just a little bit different. So use it as like a guidepost and then make sure that you're aware that you'll probably have to fine tune it a little bit later. Okay, Greg has an awesome question about polarizers. So the question is, does a polarizing filter have the same effect if you're shooting wide versus zoomed in, or is there an ideal focal length to maximize the polarizing effect? So this is a good question because it touches on how a polarizer really works. So we live on a sphere, but we're also in a sphere. It's 360 degrees around us, right? So there is space around us, above, below, left, right, front, back. We have a sphere that is around us. So the polarizing effect is strongest 90 degrees to the sun. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work if you're 120 degrees from the sun. It just means that it gradually tapers. So the polarizing effect is gradual and it moves around the sphere and it is at the maximum 90 degrees to the sun. So if you shoot wide, especially really wide, when you have a cloudless blue sky, you're probably going to get this effect called banding, where you get this weird blue splotch where the polarizing effect is much stronger in one area of your sky than the other. And it's just because you have so much sky in your photo and the effect of the polarizer is only strongest 90 degrees from the sun. So it can create some issues. It's just something you have to look for. And the easy solution is to just unpolarize just very slightly and it'll go away. So in terms of focal length, if you are zoomed in, you're almost never gonna run into banding because you're only focusing on such a small area of sky. So there is no ideal focal length to maximize the polarizing effect, but some focal lengths minimize the downsides of a polarizer better than others. So I hope that was helpful and not confusing.
Well, there's also a little trick, which if you use a graduated filter and bring it in from the corner, the opposing corner, you can kind of trick it out and sort of hide that effect.
Yeah, you could balance it out just a little bit. Karen had a great question for you, Jim. If you want to.
Yeah. Can you please read it to me?
Yes. She said, Jim, you mentioned a new product coming in the next few months. For someone without a system, should you wait for the launch or decide now, or to decide between a round or square system? So she's asking if she should wait or not.
And I actually did answer her, and I answered it to everyone else, which is, you know what? There's always something coming. There's always a better computer. There's always a higher megapixel camera. There's always some new flashy new thing that's coming along. But basically, if you use a square system, if you embrace the square system, the V7 is the system for the coming years. In round filters, I don't know, but I do hear that we're going to go into different kind of builds. Take a look at our ND Vario True Color ND filter, and you'll see a little bit of a hint of where we're going. We're going away from filters that are very small and tiny and that you can't get your fingers on, and getting to filters that are built a little bit bigger and that you can really get your hands on and they don't vignette.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. And the answer is there is always something coming and we're just going to buy it all. Can't help myself. Get all the new things.
Well, I always laugh about I think I just cleaned out my closet, and because I won't try to sell them and ship them because they're too big, I think I got rid of 6 camera bags. And that's probably just from the last 15. I can't even tell you how many camera bags I've owned over like 40 years of shooting. It's ridiculous.
It's because there's always a new one. There's always a new one.
It's like shoes. They're so
I know. It's a really expensive hobby. Laura asked me a question about using a wireless remote when I'm shooting waterfalls or landscapes. Laura, so I do have one. I just, for some reason, I constantly bump it to be disconnected. And I'm so in the habit of using a 2-second timer that I just do that. But the remote does come in handy if I'm doing seascapes, for example, because you don't want to use a 2-second delay. Like, you want to get the shot at the moment you hit the button because the wave is coming and timing is important. So it depends. Usually I'm doing a 2-second shutter delay, but if I'm being honest with myself, a wireless remote's probably a better thing for me to be using, but old habits die hard.
Well, our wireless remote is pretty cool. Because Michael asked, the cable on it is roughly about, it's roughly about 18 inches long. And it's really just a dongle that hangs off your camera, and then it Bluetooth connects to your phone, and it's really cool. And I actually saw the unit almost a year before it came out, and I couldn't even figure out what it was. But then when we finally got it, it's coiled so it can stretch. But really all it needs to do is just hang off the camera and then connect to the phone. And your phone, I think, can be up to about 30 feet away from the camera. And that whole setup is really a super cool setup, especially the fact that it's so inexpensive at $59, and you get every cord for virtually every camera that we make it for. And so you just can buy it. And then if you buy another camera, you already have the cord. It's super cool. It's a super cool solution that our company came up with.
Very cool. Yeah, Lee, me and you, man, we have talked about this you're just gonna have to carry both sets, man. Yeah, he's talking about having to carry 2 different sets for all of his lenses, but
Well,
that's
an easy solution is to concentrate on the 150 and buy the threaded adapters for your 150 adapter. It's like this, you'll be carrying less, but it's all bigger. So,
so
but
Jim, you're saying he could just carry the 150 and it could fit all of his lenses?
yeah, because you can buy a thread adapter and just put the basically you change out the dedicated adapter for the specific lens you have with a thread adapter, and you just move back and forth. You put the threaded adapter on your threaded lens, you put the fitted adapter on your other lens, and then you just swap back and forth the CPL and the filter frame.
All right, perfect. Lee, I hope you took notes.
If not, you can always call us.
Perfect. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, or if people have them, they can keep asking. Which polarizer is my favorite? Okay. So it was the enhanced landscape filter, and it still is. I still use that one sometimes because it makes the green so beautiful, especially if I'm shooting in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which I do a lot. Because the enhanced landscape filter has just really nice saturation to it. But right now, the one I'm currently just using all the time is the True Color, which is the newest one. And honestly, the color it's exactly what the name says. It is true to color, which is hard to find in a polarizer. So there's almost no color cast whatsoever.
Hey, I'm going to do something real quick if I can. Matt, who's saying, well, I don't get good exposures with my Sunstar, and it's a little dark, and it's a, well, are you seeing the sunset?
Mm.
No?
Oh, nice.
Beautiful shot.
Is that Matt?
That's Matt's.
That's beautiful.
It's gorgeous. All right. There you got, we've never done that before, Matt. That's just for you.
Showing you off. Yep. Richard asked about the Explorer tripod head. I see Andrew answered him already, but I do want to just say that, like, the Explorer tripod series, I've gotten my hands on one of them. I'm very, very impressed with the quality per value, like, ratio there. I think it's really awesome. So Richard, if you have questions, just ask me or contact Jim, but you can let me know and I'll talk to you about it, since we're friends.
All right, we're going to take advantage of it and call it a night.
All right, let's do it.
Guys, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. Very interactive night, which is what we really love to see. Taylor, great seeing you. Hope to see you soon somewhere.
Somewhere.
All right. Guys, thank you very much. Do want to make a reminder, if Andrew's on point, he'll have the screen up in a second, that we have no more questions. We're done with that. Anyway, for any of you that missed it, it will be on the Nisi Optics USA YouTube channel, and it's all there. If you ask questions, you're not going to get an answer.
Yeah. I also have some other webinars on the Nisi YouTube channel. So if you want to see one just about applying ND filters or just about polarizers, you can go check those out, because they'll really deep dive into those topics and hopefully answer more of your questions.
Great. And you've got the discount. I hope you guys take advantage of it before the 13th. Listen, thank you very, very much. And we'll send out the link. You can watch this again. Watch it as many times as you want. It's not as paid for streaming service. It's all free. Taylor, good night. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate everyone for being here.
Okay, bye.
Bye.